Good morning again to everyone who just joined us for UC Davis Team Research Forum on this really nice Friday. This is actually our last session of the 2021-2022 academic year, so I'm very grateful to everyone who has come to all the sessions or some of the sessions or one of the sessions. We put this together for you, hoping to help you learn a little bit more about the research that is going on at UC Davis or resources that you can find within or outside the campus walls. So today we are going to have a really exciting presentation that a lot of our research development team has been really looking forward to. We are hosting Professor Kyle Lewis, who is the department chair and professor of technology management, and Christian A. Philippe endowed chair at UC Santa Barbara. Professor Lewis does research on team performance and innovation and has published in premier scholarly journals and received international recognition. She teaches courses on leadership, managing diverse teams, and collaborative innovation. She also has extensive experience in technology ventures and software engineering, product management, and technology strategy consulting. Some of our research development colleagues had the opportunity to hear her speak at one of the credits workshops as part of the research development activities this year, and thought that this was especially relevant topic and speaker for this forum, and we are so happy that she agreed to join us today and speak to us about how to leverage team diversity and what are some of the skills and potential challenges that we might run into as we work on building these more diverse, cohesive teams around research. And with that, I'm going to let her take on the helm and talk to us about this topic this morning.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Anna. This is one of my favorite topics. I've been studying teams for 25 or so years and been really interested in understanding, in particular, how science and engineering teams function. Teams that for whom the currency is knowledge, if you will. So this is about really how do you harness all of the resources that are available in your team so that you can perform and that you can innovate. And so you don't experience what we in the teams literature would call a process loss, which is when having the team is actually worse than not having the team. Today, I'd like to, thank you for inviting me, and I'd also like to have a nod to the credits group. This was an advanced grant that began about 8 years ago. It was a joint collaboration between the UCs and the Cal States, which was an innovative way to initially help research development professionals understand how to form teams and also manage teams. And it grew into how to help the researchers actually manage the teams that they're in. So thank you to the credits. I'm still on their advisory board. They're still doing very, very good work. So we love to hear and we love to see people say, diverse teams are more innovative. Diverse teams are more innovative. And that is, it can be true. How about that? It can be true. It's not always true. So diverse teams can be more innovative, but we need to recognize that teams themselves are complex systems. So they're made up of interacting humans and machines, interacting humans, machines, and tasks. And when any one of those links in the system of the group changes, then the group itself changes. And we're just recognizing, I would say, in my discipline, these feedback loops, these time-based kinds of studies of how teams function and what teams do to make themselves more innovative or not. So the study of teams goes way back. So starting in the 50s, people were really interested in teams, recognizing that people working with other people is qualitatively different than people working by themselves, either learning or performing tasks. And in my discipline, which is organization science, we study a lot of teams inside organizations. And of course, this is most exciting because the validity of our work is increased when we study actual teams instead of studying freshmen in a college and then extrapolating to workforce teams. So organization teams are really kind of a gold standard that we use when we study teams. However, it doesn't provide some controls that we need to parse out all of the variability in organization work teams. So work teams start at different times. Some tasks are complicated, some tasks are not. Some teams are big, some teams are small. Some teams have good managers, some teams have poor managers. So there's heterogeneity that is important in the team that is very difficult to capture when you're studying teams in the wild, so to speak, because you need large sample sizes and you need some homogeneity in order to make statements about what makes teams work more or less well. I've been studying science and engineering teams for a while, understanding how they work together. Their collaborations are sometimes quite different from what we would see in a work team. Organizational work teams can tend to be more hierarchical than science and engineering teams, although I have seen some pretty hierarchically organized or hierarchically thinking PIs in my work, and a lot of effort or questions have arisen about how do I deal with a PI who really sees me as a low person on the totem pole and he or she is the boss. We also study military teams, and this is an area that was pioneered early in the 80s, really, studying how they coordinate together. And this has become even more interest to researchers because the military is operating a bit differently now than it was 20 years ago. We have more small teams, small squads working in the military, and often they're deployed in dangerous places with 4 or 5 other personnel, and they can't communicate very loudly, so they can't speak. Often they're deployed with a robot of some sort. And the question then is, what do we do when coordination is so important, but we don't have the traditional tools that we were used to using to coordinate our activities? And finally, and certainly not least, we study medical teams. And this is of interest to us in part because the consequences of performance are life and death, or infection and non-infection, or reinfection. So these teams are special in that the outcomes matter a lot more than on time, on budget performance in an organizational project team. The other thing that's interesting about medical teams is these are personnel that often work on shifts. So when I was at the University of Texas, I worked with some neurosurgeons who were very concerned about my research talking about turnover and how bad turnover is for teams, because they recognized that in the course of a single neurosurgery that might last for 10 or 12 hours, they might see at least 1, maybe 2 shift changes, which means different personnel, which if you were designing surgery from a group's perspective, you would never do that. So having that kind of turnover is very, very challenging. And when I talk with these docs, they basically say, I try to do my surgeries as early in the morning as possible with the team that I know. So they try to keep the team that they know intact because they recognize that these handoffs are potentially disruptive and potentially dangerous. So how do people like me in organization science study teams? We study them in lots of ways. And I mentioned teams in action that are in the field. We also do funny little things in the laboratory, like we have teams of people building things. So what you see here in the human subjects laboratory, this is some research that I did at the University of Texas. It's something that has been sort of copied from Anita Woolley's work. These are assembly tasks where there are trade-offs that have to be made. In this particular case, for example, yellow bricks were somewhat rare, and blue bricks had to be used in the pool. So we give them sort of a specification sheet of how things ought to be built, and they needed to build a house, a garage, and a pool to certain specifications, and then we disassembled them and graded them on meeting specifications. And what we're able to do in a lab is control for a lot of the things we can't control for in real life. So it's the same task for everybody. It's the same amount of time for everybody. The task rules are identical for everybody. We can bring in a lot of different people, a lot of diverse people into the lab. These are typically done with undergraduate students. Undergraduate students come from different majors, which adds some diversity. Our undergraduate populations tend to be more diverse than some of our science teams. So we're able to look more specifically at how variables affect a variable of interest like team performance or team innovation with these sort of highly controlled experiments. You might see in this case, the team had some extra time and they put trees and flowers, which was not part of the specification, but that certainly added some innovation or creativity points for them. The third way that we study teams is with computational modeling. One of the problems with the way we study teams is we do these snapshots. We say, what is this team doing now? And how does that relate to performance maybe later? But we usually don't have longitudinal studies of teams, meaning teams that we study, we go in and we survey them once a week for 6 months, let's say. There are explorations like this, but as you can imagine, they're very, very time intensive. And they tend to focus on fewer teams, but they do a deeper dive into those teams over time. Computational modeling helps us with this time variable. So we can build models that have feedback loops, that have maybe disruptions that are controlled, and that tell us what might happen over time. And then we can generate new hypotheses from these models that we can then study in the lab and the field. So in the chat, if we could have a few volunteers, what in your view makes a research team work very well or less well? And I'll rely on Anna to help me read what's in the chat, just a few ideas. And I can cold call on a few people because I know some of them. Shared vision, a leader who listens, positive team interactions, expectations at the beginning, trust. Good, good, good. And when teams really fail, what are some of the reasons that they fail? Is the reverse of these things? Conflict. Okay, that's a good one. Diverse agendas. Lack of a common goal. Okay, this is terrific. Power hoarding. Yes. Okay. Team members feeling unheard. They can't speak up. Great, great, great. This is terrific. So fortunately, we've studied a lot of these things and we do have some research about them, but also some practical advice. And that's part of what we'll be talking about today. So What does the science tell us about diversity in teams and innovation? And what practical techniques can help us overcome some of the challenges? And I want to emphasize that this is my view of the literature. You might get a team diversity talk that is quite different from this, but this is sort of how I've made sense of the literature and the research that's been done in this area, especially when it comes to knowledge and expertise and science and research. So one of the things we learn right away is that you don't always need a team. And in fact, teams are best when these three things are requirements of the task. So the task is very knowledge intensive. So no one person has all the knowledge to do everything that must be done. Where the activities are interdependent, where you rely on other teammates for parts of the task or parts of the product or parts of the information. And where different expertise or perspectives are needed, where different perspectives actually help the product or the outcome or the process that you're looking for. If you don't need different expertise, then a single group of people with the same expertise could actually solve a mathematics problem, for example. But most of the problems that we're talking about today are extremely complex, where different expertise is bound to help, but it's also a source of tension that needs to be managed. And as I was looking at these, I was realizing that, wow, you can really look at these and tell right away when something's going wrong. So let me give you an example. So the task is knowledge intensive, and I've got this little fulcrum at the bottom. There are good signs that the team is actually managing this knowledge intensity, and bad signs. And some of the good signs include these. You see people sharing knowledge. They're exchanging ideas. The members understand who knows what and who's good at what. And you see smooth integration of members' different knowledge, sometimes leading to innovation. So this would be building on other people's knowledge rather than just listening and then moving on. Some bad signs is when you start seeing patterns of knowledge sharing that exclude some members. And many of you are familiar with network kinds of techniques for studying this. You can study communication networks, and it becomes very obvious when there are groups of people that work together and share knowledge, and then there are groups on the periphery. So you may notice this just by managing or watching teams. If members aren't sure about who knows what, or they make errors in their assumptions about who knows what, which happens quite frequently with people of color and with women. And if you notice that important task knowledge just isn't used in the activities and the discussions. The second piece of what could make a team great are it's leveraging its interdependencies. And the good signs of that are high coordination, especially during handoffs. This happens very frequently in shift-based work, but there are handoffs in other types of projects too. Different phases of projects require different handoffs and different information. So when coordination is high, it tells you that those interdependencies are working quite well. When there are clear roles and responsibilities, it's hard to do handoffs if you're not sure the person who you're handing off to actually understands. And there's a high level vision of interrelated research thrusts and personnel, and that is communicated. So I'll talk a lot about this theme of having a high level vision and understanding how all the parts work together a little later as well. Some bad signs, if you see, subgroups operating independently without much integration. Subgroups sometimes are efficient, but if they can't work across subgroups, then some knowledge will be lost in that chasm. If the role structure is unclear, we have decades of research that suggests that when the role structure of an organization is unclear, that coordination suffers, that performance suffers, and that you get duplication of effort, which is rarely a good thing. And the workload is often concentrated in a few members. So here you might see that 3 members are doing most of the work and the others are not. And it's worth asking the question, why? And then finally, are you using the different expertise and perspectives that are needed for teams to really do well and to leverage knowledge and to innovate? The good signs, you might see people amplifying the comments of others that have different perspectives, building off of each other's ideas. You have deliberative decision-making where you're considering multiple solutions, not just voting on one solution. So you've identified the key factors in the decision and you have maybe 3 versions of a solution that could work and you walk through them deliberately. Superordinate team identification, I'll talk more about that later. So team identification can be a glue that allows people to feel safe divulging and sharing their expertise. And psychological safety is related to this idea that I, as a team member, feel comfortable raising a concern that I've observed. And we'll speak about that in the context of status hierarchies as well. Some bad signs. Wow, we converged quickly, but it's the same old solution. And RD professionals, maybe have seen this before. I certainly have reviewed a lot of proposals that look a lot like the proposal before it that was funded. And I'm thinking, what new are they going to do? So if teams are converging very quickly on a solution, it's worth wondering, how new is it? Is it something we've known before? And did we curtail our discussions prematurely, which is more typically the reason? A lot of interruptions during meetings. Interruptions not only disrupt the flow, but it tends to be centered around interruptions of certain people, certain disciplines get interrupted more often than others, for example. Women are more often interrupted than men. People in sort of lower status disciplines are interrupted more than those people in higher status disciplines. And a lot of times people don't know they're interrupting. So there are techniques that we've found work quite well to stop interrupters, and you don't have to be mean to do it. The other thing that you might observe is that there are blind spots. There are some stakeholders or members who don't have the opportunity to integrate or to input information. And then, of course, psychological unsafety, this feeling that I'm too low on the status hierarchy to say anything. I'm afraid to say anything. I'm afraid to look stupid. I would never say that in front of my boss. I'll just stay quiet. So these are things that you can observe in your own meetings. And then the question becomes, all right, now what do we do if we see some of these bad signs, or how do we leverage some of these good signs? And that's what I'll speak to you again. So I know that we don't have a ton of time, but I'd like you to be thinking about this exercise, and maybe you'll do it on your own time or give it to a group that you work with. Ask them to take out a piece of paper or a spreadsheet and list the names of people who they most trust, not relatives, and give them about 5 to 10 minutes. It's not easy to get beyond 5 people when you do this, but who do you most trust? And you might think of 5 people just on your own right now. And then you ask them, who are these people and what are their characteristics? And what typically happens is that the people we most trust are very homogeneous in terms of one or more of these factors. We might get some heterogeneity in gender, maybe some in age, but then when we get to ethnicity, variance in education, sexual orientation, disability, or able-bodied, these are things that maybe we don't have a lot of diversity in our small trust group, our network of most trusted people. And I've done this exercise in a lot of places. I did this with the hospitalists at our local hospital. And they were quite surprised by this because they thought their teams were quite diverse. And when they did this exercise, they realized they weren't. So the small group of highly trusted people is really your trusted network. But if we want diverse teams, then we have to go beyond our trusted network, which tends to be people who are a lot like us. And if you expand it a little bit, maybe there are people that you're comfortable with that maybe you don't know that well yet. And maybe there are people that you are getting to know. And getting PIs, getting team members who are assembling teams to get beyond this trusted network is quite difficult. And the reason when I ask them why they haven't done this is they bring up the question of risk. So this is a project that we can't, take a lot of risks on, and I need to have the people around me who I trust. So this happens quite frequently. Of course, these trust relationships can be developed, but what you're getting when you go a little bit farther out in your network is more diversity and potentially more innovation because of that. So we tend to trust people who seem similar to us. And this is part of what leads to homogeneous rather than diverse teams. And I hear PIs talk about this a lot of times when they're trying to recruit graduate students. So they graduate from the same, they recruit from the same labs in the same institutions over and over and over. And if those labs and those institutions are not diverse, then neither will this new lab team be. A lot of people ask, okay, I'm about to, compose a team. What are the secrets to composing a team? And I would love to be able to tell you that after 50 years of studying teams, we know exactly what the formula is. But my read of the literature is that we don't know. We can't give the prescription of how to create teams. There isn't a software package that is extremely well validated and widely used that tells you what kind of team you should pick, often because it has to do a lot with the task. So picking team members for a task would be more important than just picking team members based on who you like to work with. But in general, when you're picking a team, of course, you need the right expertise. You need the people with the right skills and knowledge. You need maybe some diversity in that expertise, because that's where a lot of the new innovations, the new thinking is going to come from. We love to talk in organization science about a firm called IDEA, which is California, Silicon Valley-based firm. They invented the mouse. They worked a lot with Steve Jobs at Apple. They've focused on human-centered design or design thinking. But the company itself, who is creating these products, is very famous for hiring a lot of diverse people, not just in terms of demography, but in terms of their background. So you might get an electrical engineer and an opera singer and an anthropologist working on a project together. And, why is this? It's because the anthropologist can say, oh, this reminds me of something in my discipline that I understand. And now we can share it together and build from that. So it allows for a lot greater variance in the kinds of ideas that pop into mind and then become available to the team for innovative potential. In terms of personality, here I would just say, don't get fixated on personality, just find a variety. And the reason for this is that the research on some personality traits is quite robust on team performance, but not always. And there's other research that suggests that personality types of many sorts are helpful. So for example, research out of UCLA suggests that introverts are actually great to have on your team rather than a whole bunch of extroverts. The introverts actually do a lot of work and a lot of thinking. So don't be afraid to pick introverts and extroverts. There are people who think in terms of big picture, and there are people who think about detail orientation. Well, again, you need both. If you have only people who can think about theory and think about things at the 30,000 foot view, then who's actually going to do the work and figure out how it's going to be done? On the other hand, having too many people who are focused on the details might mean that you go off on a lot of tangents, or you go down some rabbit holes that maybe you didn't need to go down if you had that higher level sort of point of view about what are we trying to do here? What is our goal? What is our vision? What is tangential and what is core? And then my personal favorite, worriers and non-worriers. We used to call this neuroticism. So worriers on a team tend to be people who annoy us because they can tell us very quickly why something's not going to work. This will never work because, or we'll never get that done in time because. I suggest that you listen to these people, because these people are your risk management professionals. They're very good at assessing risk. And instead of being annoyed by the comments, put them in charge of worrying about those things. Put them in charge of being devil's advocates. Make sure that they know they're in charge of this worrying, and make sure everyone else knows that they're in charge of this worrying, so that they have permission to say, wait a second, we haven't thought about this feature, this factor, we need to give it more attention. And then the non-worriers are people who are kind of laid back and just sort of go with the flow. Well, you need a couple of those people too. So again, a mix is better than picking a lot of similar personality types. And finally, demography. For years we used demography as the only form of diversity, but the research on expertise suggests that these overlap in many ways, and they can overlap in ways that are very, very advantageous for teams. So bringing in people who have different perspectives, like the opera singer and the anthropologist, helps you understand more about the problem space and more about the solution space, even more importantly. But there's a problem with this, and some of you actually wrote about this in the chat, that our expertise that is so valuable isn't always recognized. And so I'll give some ideas about how we can work on that. So here are some techniques, and I'll watch my time here, and I'll move forward if we run out of time here. So the four things that when I look at the literature that I think are the real hot buttons of what makes teaming hard are the power structure in a team, goal differences, and knowledge utilization. And I'll speak a little bit about conflict if we have time as well. This is a great quote from Robin Ely and Davis Thomas. Increasing diversity does not by itself increase effectiveness. What matters is how an organization harnesses diversity and whether it's willing to reshape its power structure. Wow. Reshape its power structure. That is kind of massive. And a lot of groups, a lot of organizations are willing to view it in quite this way. But it really must be done in order to really harness what we hope to get from diverse members of teams. So where does this power structure come from in research groups? It can have to do with your formal hierarchy, maybe your title, you're a full professor, you're an endowed chair, you're an assistant professor, you're a doctoral student. It can be defined by your tenure in the organization or by your experience. It can be, there are status hierarchy in disciplines, which I got a nice lesson in. I was working with a pharmaceutical firm in drug development, and I was asking them what disciplines were obvious in their teams, and they named, 5 or 6. And I said, well, which discipline has the highest status? And they all said in unison, the chemists. Now, this may not be true for every research team, but I found it really interesting that they all knew who has the highest status. And I said, and who has the lower status? And they said toxicology, which made me very concerned as a consumer of pharmaceuticals, that the toxicology person is the lowest status person in the group. And I wondered, what information does that tox person have that isn't really getting through? And it's even worse when these align with demographic differences, which often they do. So the toxicology scientists in this particular organization were mostly women. The chemists in this organization were mostly males. Okay. So reducing status differences is something that it's hard for PIs to do. But even just small things, recognizing each person has important and perhaps unspoken or unique input. There's evidence in humans and in apes, for example, that eye contact connotes that you're looking at a high status person. So when you're having meetings, make sure that you're making eye contact with everybody in the group. Maybe even, just saying to yourself, in this meeting, I'm going to make eye contact, especially with the quote lower status people in the group, maybe people of lower rank. And amplifying members' comments, this is something that's so easy to do, and leaders can do it and members can do it. So this when someone is interrupted, for example, you can go back to a comment that was interrupted and say, Renee had an interesting comment that I'm not sure she finished. Renee, can you come back to the idea of X? So I've amplified Renee with a good comment. So I've linked in people's minds a good comment with Renee, and that will stick in people's minds better when they think about that comment later. They're less likely to forget who said it. Oh, it must have been somebody else, the higher status person. And one of the things that I've studied is performance management, which I think we do a terrible job with in teams, and we don't do much of it at all in research teams. This became very salient to me again in the same pharmaceutical firm. I was asking about promotions. They were concerned about promotions not being equitable by gender, even though the hiring of all their PhD scientists was pretty equitable. And when we were going through the way that people were promoted, the way people were evaluated, there was this refrain that was, we haven't seen her science yet. This impression that for especially the females in a lab, that she hadn't proven herself yet. She hadn't proven herself as an independent scientist, or they weren't aware of the science that she contributed. And this was especially important, or this comment came up a lot when they were thinking of who to promote as director of a lab. And this was a very frightening idea to me, that some of this would be invisible work. There's a lot of research on this, invisible work and how we evaluate people. There's great research coming out of the Clayman Institute that's a machine learning work that finds that performance management for females tends to be more vague than it does for males. And this vagueness is a problem because it's hard to improve on a vague comment or a vague goal. Vague goals do nothing to motivate us, according to the goal setting literature. So vague feedback isn't telling us how we should improve. In addition to being vague feedback, it's feedback that's focused more on style than on actual outcomes or processes. So this is a problem that we've had in the groups literature for a while, but it's really coming to the fore when we start studying science teams that are meant to be more diverse and more integrated. We can't have half of the team be invisible here. One of the things that I recommend for research teams is by creating team measures of performance. These are individual measures, but they're focused on the team context itself. So you're still evaluating individual scientists, but you're evaluating them in additional ways, not just their own science, which you might not be aware of, but what does the member contribute to the team? How does this member facilitate functional team processes? How does the member contribute to or manage conflict? How does the member contribute to the performance of others? How much does the team member identify with the team? All of these things are things we can measure right away, right now, and you might come up with your own. What are the team-oriented behaviors in your lab that are helpful? It's even more likely to be impactful if this was something that research development professionals did with a new team, a new research team. Have them identify what team-oriented behaviors are helpful in your team, and then measure them. I tell all of the female and people of color, the scientists of color that I work with, to keep track of these things, whether they're measured in your lab or not. You keep track of them. And then in your merit cycle, you can talk about your contributions to the team, and maybe we can undo some of this invisibility that we see a lot in these teams. Goal differences are very common, and one of the solutions is to create a new goal, one that overarches the whole team, and that can become the team glue. So what is the overarching goal of your team? What science are you trying to investigate? What values do you have? And I would suggest that you put the goal and the values of this team, of this research project, on a whiteboard every time you meet, or it's at the top of the slides every time you meet. Going back to the checklist manifesto, we know it, but when we read it again, we know it even better. So what is the goal of the research team, and what do we value? This can be very, very helpful. It ends up diminishing people's personal goals and elevating to the goal at a higher order. And that tends to reduce the sort of more idiosyncratic goals of members. There's new research that I've been involved in that suggests that we also might think about our goals a little differently. So we typically think about our goals in terms of outcomes. We want to produce a product. We want to produce an innovation, a new material. But often we do not focus on goals of learning or goals of increasing knowledge. And we have some evidence now in teams that when teams tend to focus on learning goals, not only does the team learn more and perform better, but the individual members learn more and perform better. So, as we think about goals for teams, it would be great if we thought about, what can we learn on this project that could be leveraged, that could be transferred, that could be reused. I've talked with granting agencies about this, about not having goals that are purely based on outcomes, but that are based in part on creating transferable, reusable knowledge. And these types of goals can be very motivating for people. And they're things, by the way, that the invisible people are going to be maybe more involved in. Knowledge utilization is something that I've studied for a while. And here is, again, how do we make use of all of the knowledge on the team that we have? There's evidence that we don't do this very well in teams, but some of the fixes are things like this. Learn as a team and practice as a team. There's evidence in a lot of technology domains that when you learn as a team, you'll perform better as a team. If you practice as a team, you perform better on a team. And of course, we know this from sports. We would never throw 5 people on a basketball court that had never practiced together. Of course we wouldn't. And yet we throw 5 people who don't know each other into an operating room, or 5 people who don't know each other into a research project kind of frequently. So this is a big problem. We're studying how distant the practice has to be from the actual task. We're not sure how distant it has to be. Can you, play soccer and then perform well on your science team? Maybe not, but maybe there are some things that you learn by doing a different type of task. Face-to-face interactions make understanding team knowledge much, much better. We get cues from each other, facial cues, body cues that help us actually remember things we know. And this is very, very helpful. And we don't find this in teams that are not co-located. And then using those team-oriented performance measures. Again, lots of papers on this. So understanding who knows what, who's doing what, allow for all members to provide or use their expertise, and debrief for knowledge use and adaptability. What this means is if you've got turnover in your team, debrief not just about what went wrong, what went right, but debrief also about who knew what, who knows what, who could take over knowledge for somebody else. We tend to, when turnover happens, make the assumption that the new person is going to do exactly what the person who left did, which of course means that we're not using the new knowledge that they have, and we're probably wrong about the knowledge that they have. So these are some ideas that have worked in the teams that we've studied. In meetings, I heard someone say, help me with interrupters. This is information that I've gotten mostly from practitioners. They say you need to limit the airtime hogs. They have rules that they claim work. Rules like you can't speak twice until everyone has had a chance. Well, I would argue that maybe some lower status members in a team don't want the chance to speak up in every case. But you certainly can clamp down on interrupters. Have a neutral person in the back of the room counting interruptions by whom, to whom, and report those data back the next time. I guarantee it makes an impact. People don't realize they're interrupting, and then when they see the data, they're horrified. Other things you can do is before the meeting, assign people to speak or report on specific issues. And then when you call upon them in the meeting, they're prepared, they're less concerned about their own psychological safety, and everybody in the room knows, oh, she's the expert on this. She was asked to report on this issue. And finally, allowing people to contribute after the meeting if somebody doesn't feel comfortable inside the meeting speaking up. Invite people to come to you if you're the leader and to contribute that way. Okay. I'm going to go through this quite quickly because I'm mindful of time, but conflict is very common in science teams. And there's a kind of conflict that's actually pretty good, the kind where you're debating the science, and another type of conflict that's not so good, where you're calling each other names. The scientific disputes that we know about tend to happen this way. So we're disputing how to interpret the data. Well, that wouldn't be a terribly toxic dispute, right? Because we need to have multiple points of view about how to interpret the data, and we need to agree on it. Difficulty in collaboration. This could be kind of personal. Maybe you don't like working with certain people. Why is that? Mentor-mentee issues, again, personal conflict. Misunderstandings around projects and assignments. That can be remedied so quickly, so easily by a leader, by a document. I'll get to that next. When you need to actually terminate somebody, of course, there's going to be conflict about this, but our research suggests that how you do it is more important than that you did it. So if you're going to terminate somebody, what is the process by which you use to decide who to terminate and why? There's evidence that people are less upset, less likely to sue you if you're in a non-academic environment, although it does happen there, if they believe that the process used to decide your termination or separation was in fact fair. Okay. And of course, the authorship credit and recognition is the biggest fight. These things should be worked out in advance. So I'm recommending collaborative research agreements as ways to increase trust, because people understood what's expected of them. People understand what the norms are in the research group. People understand what sort of credit they will get on publications. And people have thought through, what if somebody keeps asking people out on dates in the lab group? What should we do? Who should respond? Do we care about that? Is our lab open 24/7? If it is, why is it open 24/7? Understanding that certain of the quote norms in lab groups are actually perpetuating forms of discrimination. Just a quick bit of information about that may be all that you need to try to work on things like collaboration agreements. And again, working with the people in the lab to come up with these is the best way to really be thinking about these. A lot of labs don't have these because they want to do it the way that they were trained, and they don't want to change. So this is a hard lift for research development professionals to try to get teams to do this. Again, when I talk with NSF, I suggest they might require things like collaborative research agreements or an overarching view of the project and the thrusts in the proposals that they accept. And psychological safety, you might already know Amy Edmondson's research on psych safety. Here, leaders make a big difference because they can ask for information and invite ideas and model the behavior that when they get information that is either derogatory either to them or that creates a problem in the group, that the leader doesn't shy away from it, that the leader is curious about it, that the leader doesn't sanction about it. And this perpetuates a climate where people feel safe bringing up problems that could be corrected and not lead to even bigger problems. Team identification is something that is an interesting way to also build trust. So when you identify with the group, you think of yourself as a particular member of a social category, and you see yourself as a prototypical member, and that being a member of that group is actually important to my self-concept. And there's this old but still wonderful measure of how do you see yourself? Is yourself and this group, are you almost overlapping? Are you that tied to seeing yourself as prototypical of that group, or do you see yourself as separate? And this is an easy kind of question to give lab members in the teams that we're working with at UCSB. We're giving this to them at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, and seeing what happens. Identification has all kinds of benefits. And I want to show you some of the ways that identification can work. So here, what you're trying to do is create the research team as the in-group. You're fostering camaraderie. You might have team meetings and social gatherings, pep rallies, sort of non-work gatherings with the team. Team artifacts, it always sounds kind of silly, but branding, shirts, hats, mugs, and signs can actually make a difference. So maybe you have t-shirts made with Materials Research Laboratory on them, or hats made with, were Michelle O'Malley's research group. These sorts of things, when people wear them, show that they're prideful of the group that they belong to, and it actually glues together the group in ways that are quite advantageous. I have one, let's see if this works. I'm not sure this is going to let me show you a website for Michelle O'Malley. It's not letting me do it. websites about labs. I looked at a bunch of them, and some of them have, a list of who's in the lab with pictures, right? Others of them have who's in the lab and they're all together. So more like this, we're all together, and maybe they're all together wearing the same shirts. These sorts of things tell other people that your lab has an identity, and that being part of this lab means you have that identity too. So I'll end with, these are some of the big problems in managing teams, but they can be managed, and research development professionals can be some of the first line of not just training research teams, but also intervening when research teams may not be performing the way that maybe we hope that they do. So I will stop there, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. We only have 3 minutes, but could you stay with us for maybe an extra 5 minutes just to go through some questions?
Sure can, yes.
Thank you very much. So the first question that was posted to the chat is from Lynn Shore from Colorado State University. Do diverse teams have different types of conflict than less diverse teams?
Hi, Lynn. Do diverse teams have different kinds of conflict? I think that they do. There's a question of, if you expect diversity, then you're going to be managing diversity quite a bit better than if you expect sameness. So if people look the same, our expectations are that they're going to think the same. If people look different, then the expectation is that we're going to maybe think a little bit differently. And although this puts in a primary position the things that are visible about diversity, it does help a little bit when you look around the room and you see, oh, yeah, we're from different places. We have different lived experiences. We view this problem, this situation, in ways that are probably different from one another. So I think the types of conflicts that arise, especially in science teams, are going to be focused on things like discipline, gender, age, and rank, which is quite different from what would happen in a different type of organization.
Thank you. We have another question from Wilfred Laurier from University of Canada. Is there any research about the effect of common team building activities, such as leisure and team building games, focus groups to join on the working of research teams? So I guess what you mentioned around having activities that are not work related.
Right. So there are many team building games. One that I like focuses on the idea that knowledge is hidden among your team members and it's not easy to find it. So it's a very simple game. It's called Room 703. I've done it for credits many times. You can do it with kindergartners. I've done it with deans and provosts too, and those were very amusing to watch. But it's what's called a hidden profile game, where different people are given different information, and then they have to solve a problem together. What typically happens is how they tackle the problem matters, whether they have multiple people trying to solve the problem on their own matters. The deans and provosts did that a lot. They all had their own way of solving it, which never meant they never came to real consensus on the problem. But what's usually revealed by these games is that we don't, through regular conversation, find out everything that everybody knows. And this I've found to be the most, important lesson for teams with diverse knowledge. And this seems to be easy enough for people to do quite quickly. And it's quite memorable because they'll think, oh, I remember. I never asked that person what information they had, or somebody forgot to mention that they had some information. So all of these things happen in real life with expertise. So that's one that I like very well. other types of team building exercises that are more appropriate to building rapport. I think they can't hurt, but it would depend, where they were held, what time they were held, what day they were held, and what sorts of things people had to divulge. So I'd be a little careful with the sort of what seem like fun team building activities, because often they're prone to certain biases. Things like this hidden profile game, which is publicly available, and there are varieties. You can do a murder mystery game, you can do this room 703 game, tend to be quite neutral, and yet they still make the points that we're trying to make about harnessing diverse knowledge in groups. And I can give Anna the 703 game.
Thank you. Here's a question, and we've run into this a lot. Are diverse teams expected to be larger in size? And we run into this especially when there's a limit, right? People are putting together a proposal and they can only list 5 people or 6 people, but they have to reflect diversity. And there's always this tendency of, well, I need more people for it to look diverse. So
Yes.
More diverse people, do they have to be larger?
They do not have to be larger. In a way, just increasing the size to get more diversity isn't quite what we're going for, because then you'll have maybe more people on the periphery rather than in the core of the group work. So I would encourage people to have 5-person teams that are diverse. And if they're not diverse demographically, maybe they're diverse in some other ways that you can highlight. But really, there's not, I mean, in our institutions, there's enough diversity that we should be able to have 5-person teams that aren't all, I'll just pick one, all white women. So don't make it bigger to make it more diverse.
Here's another question. What about teams working in different contexts? For example, can we generalize the findings of organizational teams operating in established organizations to entrepreneurial teams working in an establishing firm, such as a startup or a new venture?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that the concepts very much do apply. And of course, entrepreneurial teams are keen on creating management structures that, appeal to venture capitalists and angel investors. They want to see you got the right management team on board. And this is something that I work with our entrepreneurship teams a lot. In terms of, diversity of knowledge, they get that. They understand, like I've got a marketing professional, but I need somebody in manufacturing who's going to tell me about how to run my manufacturing process. But what they don't get is really how to manage the diversity. So the things that we've talked about today are ways to help manage the diversity of these startup teams. And I would say with the team you've got, try to manage the diversity this way. So I don't think that there are different techniques for startup teams. The problem that we might see with startup teams is that they might start by choosing people who's in their small trust network, and maybe people who look a lot like them.
Thank you. Maybe a couple of more questions. Do you think the team's performance measurements should be different in temporary teams compared to stable or longer term project teams?
They probably should, yes. So you can always use those team-based measures, whether it's short-term or long-term, but you could take multiple measures on a long-term project. So particular junctures in a project where the work might change appreciably, that would be a good time to measure these things. So you can take multiple measures of some of these variables that tell you when things are getting harder, when they're getting easier, when they're getting better, when they're getting worse over time, either as the project changes or as the composition of the team changes. All of these are places in long-term project teams where you would still see these principles playing out, and you will not see uniformity across a long-lived team. I think you'll see some places where they dip and they rise. And certainly a long-lived team does potentially suffer from similar thinking over time. So getting some new people, new thinking integrated into a long-standing team is beneficial if you can integrate that new person's knowledge well.
So one last question. A lot of us who work in research development do a lot of networking activities and work with our faculty, trying to build teams and go from that continuum of I'm getting to know you to I trust you and we're going to work together. And we've run into this challenge now of running a lot of these virtually. And I was hoping to hear your comments in terms of the challenges of doing this type of work now that we are limited in bringing people together face to face. Yeah.
Yes, doing this virtually is not as good because, the neuroscience tells us, that the way we use our facial expressions and our eyes communicates, and our bodies communicates a lot of information. And when we don't have that, or we're looking at, tiny pictures, then we're missing a lot of information. We're making a lot more inferences, and some of those inferences could be quite biased. So it's hard to learn about people this way. It's hard to manage things like conflict this way. Certain things are easier, though. Psychological safety could be higher because you allow things like chats. Your chats can be anonymous. Maybe you have people providing information in a written form that maybe they wouldn't provide in a verbal form. So there are some benefits that really have come to us in this virtual world, but I would say there are more challenges than benefits to it. And it has to do with sort of creating this initial rapport and launching a project with things like goals and values, and having that be referred to over and over and over, I think can help. But these team building exercises like Room 703 can be done online. So we do that online all the time too.
Thank you so much, Professor Kyle. I think everyone is very excited about what they learned today. I think we needed 2 hours too to cover everything in detail. To just letting everyone know that we will share the recording and any online resources that Professor Kyle Lewis has shared with us. And with that, thank you so much. Please
Great.
follow
Thank
our
you
page,
very much.
and we'll let you know of the next event, hopefully in July. Have a great break, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.